introduction, what is hop creep, and a brief history. A little bit about haze in beer, a little bit about the issues which are caused during hop creep, especially diacetyl, that's in focus. Sort of the important considerations to think about, and any options that you might want to consider to avoid hop creep. So firstly, just an introduction as to what it is for anyone who doesn't know. It's essentially the re-fermentation of a finished or packaged beer. This occurrence is brought on by high dosage rates of dry hopping, which in turn provides trace amounts of fermentable sugars back into your beer. This can be a problem if you still have some yeast in suspension or any viable microbe, as it can metabolize these now fermentable sugars and turn them into ABV and carbon dioxide. So this can cause problems further down the line. I'd just add a quick note to say that even if you don't have any viable microbes in your beer, if there are enzymes breaking down your dextrins, your long chain sugars, that these enzymes do persist in packaged beer. So over time, you will see or perceive a sweetening of your beer as it ages. So the reason I called it the perfect storm is the situation sort of reminds me of the old fire triangle that you get, where you can only get a fire if there's oxygen, heat, and fuel available. And a similar situation happens during hop creep. If you've got dextrins which can be broken down, and you've got these glycolytic enzymes which come from the leafy matter in your hops, and you also have viable microbes, obviously that's usually your brewing yeast, then you will get a rise in the concentration of your ABV and carbon dioxide. Obviously, the amount of this concentration hugely depends on the amount of dextrins, contact time, the amount of dry hopping that you do, and obviously the cells that are still viable and in suspension. So just as a little brief history, it was actually in 1893 that Brown and Morris wrote a paper on certain functions of hops used in the dry hopping of beers. And they noted that there was like an after fermentation of cask ales, and that they deduced that enzymatic degradation of dextrins, so these unfermentable sugars, were being turned into fermentable sugars. And finally, that tannins inhibit this diastase. Obviously, they didn't just pluck this idea out of thin air. They had a few other hypotheses as well. They also looked at if the hops themselves contained any fermentable sugars that the yeast could consume. And they looked to see if the hops had any wild yeast attached to them to re-ferment the beer. So it was a very thorough investigation. So strangely enough, 48 years later, it was Yannick et al. In 1941 that confirmed this earlier work. They looked at peptone to bind the tannins, and they didn't find any differences based upon hop cultivar. So again, it's also quite strange that it took almost the same amount of time again. It's only been in the sort of late 2000s where people are really looking into this research again. If you're interested in it, I can suggest that you look at Tom Shellhammer's group in Oregon State University. They do a lot of work on this. So one reason that this issue is becoming even more prevalent recently is with the popularity of hazy beers, particularly things like NEPAs. So I just wanted to show this as an example of what can cause haze in your glass. Obviously, you can have some contamination of unwanted microbes that can cause haze. Brewing yeast, proteins, polyphenols, and then any other trub or hob particulate. So obviously, I'm not saying all these are in your NEPAs, but there's certain things that you want to cause haze and certain things that you want to keep out. But if you have yeast and any hop particulate staying in your packaged beer, then if there's any dextrins, then there's the possibility that hop creep can happen in your packaged beer. So again, just to highlight these issues, you can get over attenuation, so a higher than expected alcohol levels. You can get over carbonation in your kegs and cask, so that can cause real issues when you're trying to pour your beer. Quite like this picture here of if Monday was a beer. Beer in small pack can explode. Recently, this has been an issue for some brewers. You can't always expect consumers, or if you sell into shops, for them to keep beers refrigerated. So the elevated temperatures will certainly increase the prevalence of this happening if all those things are there, and they will happen much more quickly. And finally, the product won't be in the parameters that you were expecting. So this can cause a host of issues. Obviously, you put a lot of time and effort into your recipes and trialing your beers, so you want it to turn out how you expected. But you also need to think about the safety and legal requirements. When you put labels on, you need to be within the allowed limits. And if a re-fermentation is taking place and the ABV goes higher, then that is a legal issue. So one thing is you can make sure that dry hop creep is the issue prior to trying to fix it. So consider if there's any contamination, you can send samples off for microbiology. Have you checked your yeast source? Was it healthy to begin with? Has the yeast changed in any way at all? Can your yeast ferment multitrios? Have you changed yeast strain recently? Maybe the strain that you were using before was multitrios negative, so it's just something else to consider, that some yeast can metabolize different sugars. Did this occur when changing malt varieties? Consider what sugars are available at the beginning. One thing you can do is check that dry hopping is adding extract. So what I mean is extending the limit of your attenuation. So when you've got an active fermentation going, I would suggest taking off a decent sample, so maybe in one of these sort of 5-litre containers. This is prior to dry hopping, and put it somewhere warm, obviously not too hot to deactivate any yeast, but just to make sure that the fermentation completely takes place. And then check your readings with your saccharometer. Compare this to what you get after dry hopping, and then you'll see the extent of the change that dry hopping is making on your beer. So another issue is diacetyl. So I just wanted to refresh people as to what it is. It's perceived as a buttery, sort of milky, oily flavour, sort of like butterscotch. So think about movie popcorn or Werther's Originals. It can cause like a milky or slick sensation on the palate. It's easier to detect in light lagers. And any added complexity in a beer, such as like your darker, more robust flavours, like in a stout and a porter, is really going to make detection more difficult. So it's something that you need to think about. The flavour threshold is 0.04 milligrams per litre. And it's usually considered an off flavour, but it is appropriate in low levels in some styles. So obviously, if it's something that you want, then don't try and get rid of it. It can become more prevalent during aging. So diacetyl can become more pronounced over time in packaged beer. That has the precursor of diacetyl, alpha-acetolactate, in it. As the alpha-acetolactate breaks down, it forms diacetyl, and heat accelerates this process. So something you might want to consider is the use of an enzyme to mitigate this precursor, alpha-acetolactate. The enzyme alpha-acetolactate decarboxylase, or ALDC, stops this process, so it halts the process before diacetyl is formed. So this is important for primary fermentation, but obviously you could consider long diacetyl rests, but that increases time in tank. But it's much more of a difficult thing to think about if dry hop creep has encouraged a secondary fermentation. So to avoid diacetyl buildup, always boil vigorously for the appropriate amount of time. Aerate your fermentation well. When you cast your yeast, avoid oxygenating work further once fermentation has begun. I can't highlight enough how important it is to keep your DOs down once fermentation is going. Up your temperature slightly as you near the end of fermentation. This helps the yeast to reabsorb the diacetyl. And don't be too quick to rack your young beer off the yeast. Give it a chance to do its job. Consider the shift in metabolism if fermentable sugars become available again after dry hopping. There's going to be less active yeast in suspension, and other essential nutrients will have been depleted during the primary fermentation. This means that the reabsorption of these VDKs could take longer. So again, this is why I mentioned the use of ALDC, just to make sure that it's all been depleted. I do think it's a good idea to practice detecting diacetyl. Maybe you don't see it very often, and it's good to just refresh your senses. So you can practice by going to a local grocer or going online and picking up some butter flavouring, ideally in a bottle that's got a dropper. You can add small measured doses, a drop at a time, and compare the aroma and taste to the control. Ideally, you would do this in a light, simple lager to make the most of being able to detect it. If you can't, then just keep adding it until you can. For further practice, you can do the same thing with a different commercial beer of varying complexity, or your own. You can try it in the stouts and the porters just to see how much you would need to be able to detect it. And this makes it harder, so it's really good for training your senses. Another thing is to try a force VDK test on your beer prior to chilling. The heat force is the precursor to diacetyl, so if it's there, it will turn and you'll be able to detect it. So just some important things to consider when you're dry hopping. It's important to start with a well-made, clean fermented beer. Do not be tempted to use this as a method to cover any defects. Maybe a beer didn't turn out quite as you'd expected, or there's a strange off flavour and you want to try and cover it up. All I would say is that the likelihood is that dry hopping up will just make these things worse or turn out in a way that you don't expect. Go for the best fresh aroma varieties. They're the best ones to select for dry hopping. You know, don't be tempted to go for any that old out-of-date ones at the back of your fridge. You would need to add more of them to get those aromas, and by doing so, you're going to add more of the leafy material, which has got the enzymes in them. And it's been shown that these enzymes can be prevalent in the leafy material up to 3 years after they've been stored in a fridge. Think about your yeast activity. You can rouse it with CO2 or a rousing agent to promote mixing, and it also helps to bring those DOs right down. Temperature. So this it can be a point of contention when people are thinking about dry hopping. And do you do it hot or cold? You get better extractions at elevated temperatures, but obviously if you do it at a colder temperature, once fermentation is finished, there is less interaction between the hops and the fermenting yeast. When it's warm, when you've got yeast activity, you know, right before the end where there's still just a few degrees of gravity left, you get hop oils, linalool, bonded with glycosides, and the yeast can release these oils. So there is some thought that it's good to have this biotransformation because you actually improve the aroma and the release of these oils. There's also some hop oils which are metabolized by yeast, which produce fruity flavors. So that's another thought for the warm side. So you need the presence of fermenting yeast to get these. As an added bonus, it helps protect the beer from any oxygen, as I mentioned before, which is introduced through the dry hopping procedure. After this, you would then follow up with any VDK rests and cold stabilization. Think about how low can you go with your DOs. Again, I don't mind mentioning it again because I can't stress enough how important low DOs are. Any oxygen available towards the end of fermentation is only going to cause issues. Try and remove any yeast prior to dry hopping. So any your yeast plug at the bottom, anything that's settled out, just to ensure that there's no other biotransformation taking place that you don't want. And then think about your contact times. So a short contact time, I would say, is a maximum of 5 days. And a long one is up to 2 weeks. So obviously, the longer that these enzymes, dextrins and yeast are together, the more chance that you're going to have a complete conversion of long chain sugars into short chain sugars. It's obviously important to have sanitary and sterile techniques. Make sure you have a good CIP. Make sure you check that your CIP has worked, and ensure that contamination is not an issue. And then think about the effect of clarification and filtration. Obviously, like I said earlier, there's an interest in hazy beers, but if you do remove the particulates, then you'll have less issues. So it's important to remember that you might not be able to solve this issue, but if you know what's going on, you can figure out how to work with it. So just a few options to think about. You can do things like lower your original extract and lower your target ABV. This sort of links up with my let it happen, get it over with in the AV option. If you know that it's going to raise the ABV, then just let it happen and let that be your new target. Maybe don't dry hop. Can you get away with what you need in the kettle and whirlpool editions? Remove yeast with a filter. Can you lower the pH at all? The enzymes are most active around 4 to 5 pH. Deactivation, pasteurization. Hop enzymes are active between the 1 and 60 degrees C. The use of high alpha hops, so there's less hop material and there's more alpha acids. And again, this links to that, the use of products with less leaf matter, so your T45s, your cryo, and your CO2 products. And again, short contact time. So I just wanted to end on this note. It's very new research, again from somebody in Tom Shellhammer's lab, Lindsay Rubottom. Her thoughts were that low temperature drying is thought to preserve volatile aroma compounds, but as we've done that, we've allowed the enzymes which break down these long chain dextrins to be available. So the results of this work provide compelling evidence that the dextrin reducing enzymes in hops are temperature sensitive. Hop varieties, when they're kilned, the temperature had a significant effect on hop enzyme activity, and kilning hops at higher temperatures reduces hop enzymatic power, which in turn decreases their ability to break down residual dextrins during dry hopping and thus reduces the effects of hop creep. Again, this is very new research, so I'm sure more work needs to be done on this. So in conclusion, hop-derived enzymes from dry hopping can break down unfermentable dextrins into shorter fermentable sugars. Re-fermentation will occur in the presence of yeast or any other microbe. This can lead to diacetyl spikes, so it really needs that extra thought on quality control. These enzymes persist in packaged beer, so even if you remove the yeast, the beer can sweeten with age. Okay, thank you all for listening.